We are all afraid of something. Even daredevils have their fears. Some people get goosebumps from monsters, and some are just afraid of spiders. I'll tell you about my fear. Friday night, after coming home from work, tired, I immediately went to shower, then watch a movie. Grabbing some tea and chocolate paste sandwiches. What movie I watched, I don't remember exactly, but it didn't matter. About halfway through the movie, the lights went out in the house, and I stayed sitting on the couch under a warm blanket. After a while, the light came back on, and I saw a strange silhouette of a man outside the window. What interested me most was his face. It was gone. I had a lump in my throat. Stunned, I looked at him. The silhouette did not move. One could think that it was a mannequin. But from where? On the 5th floor of a city house? My paralysis passed after someone rang the doorbell. Never been so happy to have a visitor as I was now. Snapping out of my seat, I rushed into the hallway in a flash. My hands were shaking, and I was a little confused. The bell kept ringing. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. My neighbor was there. I opened it, and the fear was gone, as if it wasn't there, just a strange, unpleasant feeling. "Hi, neighbor. Do you happen to have any batteries?" He said hurriedly, as if in a hurry. "Hi. Somewhere there were. I'll look now," I said, and slowly went to the living room. When I stopped in the passage, I looked through the window where I had seen silhouette earlier, but there was nothing there but darkness. It's showing, I thought. I quickly went to the table where the TV stood, opened the drawer, and immediately saw the thing I needed, a pack of batteries. Took them and went into the hallway. To my surprise, my neighbor wasn't there. That's strange, I thought. Going to the door, I listened. Is there any noise on the platform? Everything was quiet. Curiosity pulled me to the landing. Opening the door, I saw the man without a face. All I could remember at that moment was that his head rested on the ceiling, his arms were unnaturally long, his back was protruding tentacle-like outgrowths, and he was wearing a black suit with a red tie. Once again frozen, I could not take my eyes off his faceless face, heaviness. It felt like I was falling somewhere, and suddenly, I woke up. I was in my bed, the silence in the room undisturbed by anything, the clock glowing soothingly on the nearby table. I calmed myself as I lay in the warm bed, my heart rate returning to normal and my breathing becoming more even. My usual morning sleepiness was gone. I hurriedly got out of bed. The cool shower invigorated me, and the hot tea relaxed me. Even though it was a dream, it impressed me greatly. The dream was so real, almost tangible. I sat at the table for a long time thinking, who was he? What did he want from me? I also thought about his face, a faceless face. It was as if it was covered with a very thick skin, but despite that, it was like a human face, scary and at the same time mesmerizing. I sat for a long time. My brain began to boil, and I looked at the clock. 14:20. I froze with surprise. 4 hours it took me on this case. The time passed very quickly. I would say it was about 10 minutes, but you can't argue with time. I quickly got up from the table and started to get dressed to go to the store for groceries. But as I pulled on my sneakers, I noticed a strange note on the door, and I got closer to look at it. The note was stained with blood. It said, "Follow," in a drawing. The drawing was of him, the same man. I was seized with fear. I was drawn to take the note. I resisted, but the urge was stronger. Tearing the note off the door, I stared at it for a long time. I had a great desire to throw it away, but I couldn't. Something from outside prevented me from doing so. I pinned the note on the wall, right next to my workplace. I kept looking at it over and over again. But I was helped awake by my grumbling stomach, supposedly saying, I should get something to eat already. I went to my favorite store, which was very close to home. When I entered the store, I immediately noticed that it was empty from the lack of visitors, for which I liked it. No fuss, no queues. I calmly chose everything I needed and paid for it. A little away from the store, I got a feeling that someone was looking at me. A rather unpleasant feeling. What was my surprise when I turned around, there was not a soul in the street. I made it safely to my apartment. After changing into my home clothes, I prepared a meal and sat down at the table. Again, thoughts of the man without a face took over my mind. And when I woke up, my food was already cold, but I was so hungry that I ate every last bit of it. Thoughts about him still hadn't completely left my head. So I sat down at my computer and began to scour the internet for any information about the man without a face. I didn't find much on the internet, but still. What I found out was that this man is called Slender. This is his nickname because of his unusually long arms and legs. I also learned that he kidnaps people, but most often children. And what happens to them then, no one knows. Before the kidnapping, the children told their parents about strange dreams. After sitting at the computer, some more looking for information, I didn't get anything else. I really wanted to sleep. I looked at the clock. It was very late. I turned off the computer, went to bed. I couldn't fall asleep for a long time, probably because of impressions, but sleep possessed me. The cold night had already taken its toll, and fear was gradually creeping in, making me shake at every rustle, every twig that crunched, every cry of birds. My hearing became extremely sensitive, increasing the volume of sounds. I slowly made my way through the thicket, treading carefully on the damp forest floor, the sound of my footsteps scrubbing away. I stopped. I felt with every fiber of my being that something was coming toward me, and I froze with fear. A quiet rustle came from behind me, something grabbed my arm, and I felt an unbearable burning pain. I woke up in a cold sweat. I even cried out and grabbed my hand, breathing hard, and often I examined it. There was a mark of a huge hand on it, as if scorched. I don't know what to do. These dreams come to me every night, becoming more and more real. I finish the story, knowing that he is right behind me. Quite recently, I was vacationing in a boarding house near my city. There were very few people at that time. I was really very bored. I only talked to a very elderly woman who sat at the gate, and her job was to keep out those who were not vacationing here. One day, I came to her again for a short conversation. Today, I would like to ask her about what is in the vicinity of the boarding house. Where can I go for a walk? She began to talk about all sorts of sports complexes and rentals, about swimming pools and rivers. But one phrase about an abandoned children's camp flashed through. She said, "There is still an abandoned camp here. A children's camp, of course. It's been abandoned for over 25 years. Something bad happened there. Some people died. Mary knows about it, her replacement. But I'm not very well. I'm old. I have a weak heart. I didn't ask her anything more, but quickly rushed to my cabin to get ready. I'm not a fan of such adventures, but it was the closest place I could find. And so I threw my backpack behind my back with a small amount of items. I think you will not be particularly interested if I will often go into detail. I immediately walked out of the gates of the boarding house, heading in the right direction. I thought I'd still have to check with Mary tomorrow to find out what happened there. I wondered. I'd been in abandoned buildings before, but I'd never found anything there, nothing mystical. Today would be more interesting because I was going there alone for the first time. I finally saw the long-awaited rusty fence that ran along the whole area of the place. I didn't even find it strange that the gate was open. This place had not been tended to for a very long time. In the first years after the tragedy, no one had taken over the place. In other words, no one had bought it. And now it was too late. Everything was abandoned. The tall grass prevented me from going through the wicket, and I stumbled and tangled in it, falling several times. When the ordeal was over, I looked around. There was a small wagon on the right, and it looked terrible, all rusted, mangled, and scribbled by the now teenagers. It didn't cause any fear, only disgust. But curiosity always prevails over everything. So I bravely climbed up the almost ruined, rusty staircase, which consisted of 3 steps. I think, whatever it was, but the wagon had survived the attack without being damaged by it, as it was clear that time had spoiled it. Of course it did, for the wagon is as far as the entrance itself. Inside, I saw a cramped room with a single bed. There was no linen on it, and it was iron. There were some boxes lying around. Something rustled under my feet, and I picked up a document from the floor. Everything was scuffed. I didn't even realize what kind of paper it was. I stared at the 4 letters that were clearly visible. It said USSR. After turning it around a little in my hands, I realized that I was holding a passport from the old days. All the numbers and letters were terribly scuffed. I couldn't understand who it belonged to, but it was enough that I recognized the approximate date of the disaster. Where did I have to run off to without my passport? It's right under my feet. We could have come back. The carriage was still intact. I couldn't find anything else here, so I left. I decided to take this with me as a memento of being here. I call it a trophy, even though I know I shouldn't do that, but it's no use to anyone else anyway. I walked closer to the small summer houses. Apparently the kids lived in them. I looked through the broken window of one of them, and there were 4 beds. Nearby were houses of different sizes. Those with more than 6 beds, one with only 2 beds. I went into one house to look around. So far, didn't see anything strange. 4 beds, with an old toy car without one wheel lying carelessly beside one of them. In general, the houses were practically black, either rotted or burned. Inside, too, everything looked horrible and damaged. I couldn't make out what had happened here. Suddenly, I heard a short but loud child's laughter from behind me. From surprise and fright, I shuddered and landed on one of the rusty iron beds. It wasn't a very soft landing. And then suddenly the car pulled away. It was the very end of April. The heat was unbearable. It wasn't the wind. I just froze in fear, unable to move. Then, quickly jumping out of bed, I ran out of the house. The silhouette of a child suddenly appeared in front of me. Then it became legible. I could clearly see the child's back, a boy about 12 years old. I slowly walked closer to him. Where did he come from here? There are no children anywhere close by, and there never were. And how did he come out of nowhere? I'm scared. I started to look at him. He was wearing a bright brown windbreaker. It was wrinkled, to say the least. It had streaks, stains, and burned holes on it. He must have been burning a fire. He was also wearing black pants, the same condition as the windbreaker. Sandals on his feet. I couldn't see what was underneath the windbreaker because he was standing backwards. I took another step closer and quietly asked him, "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer me. Then I calmed down and gathered my thoughts. It was time to leave. Lunch at the boarding house was coming up. I already started to retreat when suddenly the boy abruptly turned to face me. I saw a horrible, distorted grimace on his face. I can't even explain what kind. He didn't utter a word. My eyes widened as I saw the horrible burns and scars. His eyes were half closed. I screamed what I thought was very loud and ran for the exit. Although I knew I was running towards the exit, I didn't know where it was. I ran, trying to find an explanation. I rubbed my eyes and slapped my cheeks. The silhouettes of children began to flash by my sides. They were all mutilated, too. They were chasing me. I could hear the barely intelligible loud phrases coming out of their mouths. Run, alarm, fire. I finally found the wicket. I ran, stumbling, falling every time I lost my breath or stopped breathing. I reached the boarding house very quickly, and as I ran in behind the gate, I just fell down. My knees were bloody as I was wearing shorts and had skinned them. I was breathing very fast. The same elderly acquaintance of mine rounded her eyes and opened her mouth, throwing herself at me. "What's wrong with you?" was the last thing I remember, and also the sound of my breathing. I woke up in the nurse's station. The nurse said I had fainted for 5 minutes. It was just fatigue, and nothing dangerous had happened to me. I just didn't realize if what happened to me was true or not. What if it was just a dream? There's my acquaintance sitting at the gate, and everything is fine. I went to my house and shook out my entire backpack. A bottle of mineral water with gas, a flashlight, a phone, a small pendant, and I also noticed the very same piece of paper. Oh God, no, it was real. It's hard to believe, but yes. All night long, I waited with bated breath for tomorrow. When Mary first came in for her new shift, I ran up to her and asked her to tell me everything. From her words, a long time ago, in the USSR, where I'm from, there was a fire. 2 counselors were sleeping in their carriage, and the kids were dabbling with matches. Some boy in a brown windbreaker. I opened my mouth, brought them, and started playing with his friends. First, their house caught fire. It was late evening, and the children who were put to bed screamed. There were 147 of them, without counselors, ranging from 6 to 14 years old. Only 12 people escaped. The gate was always closed for the night. They ran to wake up the counselors. The fire covered the whole territory, as no one was sleeping anymore. The counselors were not saved. They died, saving the children. Everyone tried to squeeze into the wagon, but guess how many people got in? If the counselors hadn't gotten out, they would still be alive. Such a conclusion just startled me. Perhaps someone will not believe me, but experience all this yourself, although I will certainly not wish this even to my enemies. This story is practically archetypal in Yakutia. It goes around in various variations. The version below is the most common. It took place in a Yakut village in Soviet times. One day, in the fall, a grandfather with his son-in-law and grandchildren went to the forest to fell trees. They had a large family: grandfather, grandmother, elder son with his wife and 2 children, younger son with his daughter-in-law. The weather was good. They had time to fell many trees during the day. But towards evening, they came across one particularly strong, large larch tree, from which the axe bounced like a stone. Even the chainsaw could not take the tree. The chain was stuck every minute. My son-in-law suggested leaving the difficult tree alone and doing other things, but grandfather said that he would not be him if he did not overcome this tree. They struggled all evening, but finally managed to fell it. That was the end of the work for that day. A week later, having felled enough trees, they began to load them on the tractor trailer to take them to their village. Here, the same tree again showed a difficult character. While they were trying to load it on the trailer, it rolled back by itself 6 times. On the way, the tree still managed to fall off the trailer, although there were barriers made of rods on all sides. The next day, the men began to make firewood. One of the grandsons hit a tree with his axe, but it bounced off and hit him in the forehead. Seeing this, the old man got angry and ordered to take care of this particular tree first. After wasting a lot of time, they sawed the tree and split it for firewood. Grandfather himself carried the wood into the house and put it in the stove. Now the wood didn't want to catch fire, but grandfather doused it with gasoline, covered it with newspapers, and started the fire. When the wood caught fire, the old man started laughing. He said, "So there's something for you too, you damned wood." That night, the real horror began. The family was having dinner when suddenly the youngest son's daughter-in-law screamed. Everyone looked at her and she said that someone had just hit her in the face. No sooner were they surprised by her words than someone invisible began to hit her again, and so that the girl's head was flailing from side to side. The grandfather tried to cover her face with his hands, and then the invisible man started hitting him. He hit her in the stomach, then began to whip her in the face. When the grandfather barely ran out of the house, the invisible man started to take care of his daughter-in-law again, torturing her all evening. Then, when both her cheeks became red from the blows, he stopped. But it was too early to rejoice. At night, the invisible creature climbed into her bed, threw the blanket on the floor, and began to press its weight on her and strangle her. That's when everyone got worried. The girl is in tears. The men do not understand anything. The grandfather clutches his head, realizing that the tree was not simple. They invited the local priest. The priest with a cross, censer, and holy water barely entered, as the invisible man immediately spilled all the water on him, tore the cross from his neck, and threw it in the corner, and began to whip the priest on his cheeks. The priest barely escaped. A nightmarish life began. In the morning and afternoon, Invisible usually quieted down, but made himself known by small mischief. He put dung in the milk, or spoiled the dough, or cups on the shelves break by themselves. In the evenings, he took on his daughter-in-law every time. He beat her, grabbed her clothes, put all sorts of nasty things in her portion of food, and strangled her at night. All the others, including the grandfather, were not touched unless they tried to protect the girl. If they did, he beat them too, and much more severely than the girl. He could easily give bruises and break bones. The men themselves, no matter how hard they tried, were unable to grab him or even touch him. The grandfather, despairing, turned to a man from another village, who was known as a Yakut shaman. The man refused to come to their house, arguing that the unclean thing was obviously stronger than he was. When the shaman heard that the creature had come to their house with a tree in which it had apparently lived before, he advised them to take the remains of the tree back to the forest. They did so, but it didn't help. The roommate apparently liked it in the village. They lived like that for a month. They tried all means, from charcoal circles on the floor to prayers and cats and dogs, but nothing worked. On the contrary, after every attempt to get rid of him, the invisible man pranced with a special zeal. In the end, from such a life, the daughter-in-law had a loss of reason. She began to exhaust herself before her eyes in delirium. At that time, a military man from another village came to them, specially. Having heard the rumors, he decided that the locals were deliberately spreading obscurantism. He entered the house with an exclamation. "Well, where's that ghost of yours?" And immediately the pistol hanging on his belt went off by itself. He grabbed his belt, and immediately someone from behind the stove started throwing horse droppings at him. In panic, the soldier pulled out his pistol, looked behind the stove, and there was nobody there. Next, the invisible man started punching him in the face. The soldier ran out of the house like a rabbit and never returned. In the end, it was decided to send the daughter-in-law to her relatives in another village. As they drove through the village, she kept looking back and saying, "My poor friend can't keep up with us. He's lagging behind, beckoning me back." Then, on the way out of the village, she said, "My poor friend is left crying by a lonely birch tree." And suddenly, all the delirium went away. Her mind came back to her. Naturally, after that, the girl did not return to that village, and the marriage broke up. However, the village did not mind. As soon as she left, the invisible man seemed to vaporize. All his antics and games stopped. At first, people were afraid of every shadow, expecting his return, but it never happened.